Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, May 18th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about Pete Buttigieg, former Secretary of Transportation and former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, seems to be taking early steps ahead of a potential 2028 presidential election bid. Now, this article comes from Politico. It was about 5 days ago that it was published, but it is really relevant because Pete Buttigieg kicked off what we are now starting to see as a trend line amongst many top Democrats of his listening tour across the country. He started off in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which just so happens to be one of the states that Pete Buttigieg first visited when he ran for president 5 years ago, but it seems to be, again, laying the foundation and the framework for a possibility of a presidential election bid after Pete Buttigieg just 2 months ago made the decision that he will not be running for Senate, but left open the opportunity and the idea that he might run for president. Now, Pete Buttigieg making a lot of political headway here by talking about a number of hot-button issues and also just generally speaking, trying to be a messenger for a political party that lost the last election. And as it has come to the attention of many top Democrats here, has been answering a lot of difficult questions, but ones that will be litmus tests for voters across this country as to who they are supporting in 2028. Namely, Axios mentions how when Pete Buttigieg was inquired about whether or not he thinks that Biden should have ran for re-election, his answer was maybe. And there's all this conversation around Buttigieg and Biden, but largely speaking, it seems as if Buttigieg is trying to build out a brand identity for himself, trying to lay the framework and foundation, like I said, to run for president. And it is even more obvious that in the decision to not run for Senate, that it wasn't because his political ambitions are over. Pete Buttigieg is young, right? He is young, categorically. He would be the youngest president if elected today. What that means is that Pete Buttigieg at this moment is trying to meet the moment, at least in a way that feels that he is a messenger for the Democratic Party, but a new messenger who can win an election, who can beat J.D. Vance, who could beat maybe Donald Trump for a third term, whatever it is in 2028 on the Republican side, Marco Rubio, whoever. And I think that is what he is trying to convey. Now, this video isn't going to be much more than just a general think piece around a Pete Buttigieg candidacy, why it might work, why it might not work, what we might see as, happening over the next 3 years before the actual election takes place, because there is a lot that will happen. I do think in this current state of the 2028 Democratic presidential primary, Pete Buttigieg coming off of the Biden administration is actually doing quite well. And I say that because there are plenty of top names that seem to want to run for president, but Pete Buttigieg consistently, when you take Kamala Harris out of the fray, and even when you put her into the mix, does well in terms of nationwide polling, and that kind of explains why he's already starting to get on the ground running. And it makes sense too. Right? When Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, he immediately moved into transitioning into a campaign period. From 2021 onward, we knew that Donald Trump would be running for re-election. Obviously, he confirmed it right after the midterms, but everybody knew. It was standard convention that we were likely going to see a Biden versus Trump matchup, and that just really is what it is. That, back then, was very evident by the way that Donald Trump was going around the country, still holding rallies, right? Founding a PAC called Save America, which ended up leading into being the major PAC and organization that backed Trump's third bid for the presidency. And it also, too, again, was just so painstakingly obvious in the way that Donald Trump was inserting himself into the news, into stories, speaking on topics when former presidents and losing candidates typically do not. And it also is something to be said that when you're looking at Pete Buttigieg, who did lose the 2020 Democratic primary, has very much seen a sense of upward mobility, right? After you lose the primary, it is actually quite rare for you to end up in the administration of a candidate that you ran against. Very, very bad things are said in primaries. It's very difficult to get over that rut, right? Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama seemingly all but hated each other. And I know that's a strong word. I don't mean to use it lightly. But after the 2008 Democratic presidential primary, it wasn't pretty, right? It took years to build that foundation that eventually led to Obama giving Hillary Clinton the blessing to run in 2016, really backing her in that foundation in the general election. These things take time. For Pete Buttigieg, though, he was early on the Biden train, and that worked to his benefit, which led him to being Secretary of Transportation. Now, Pete Buttigieg is not the only Democrat who's interested in running, but like I said, he stands to be in the best position out of those who have publicly expressed interest in running. You can see that all of the candidates that I've mentioned so far, you have a former ambassador, Secretary of Commerce and governor, sports media personality, Governor Tim Walz, right? Big names, people that you obviously know, but in terms of the data that we are seeing right now, including all these potential candidates, Andy Beshear, Cory Booker, Roy Cooper, Andrew Cuomo, Ruben Gallego, Kamala Harris, Maura Healey, Ro Khanna, right? The list goes on. In the data, what we are finding is that Pete Buttigieg actually does quite well. They do these averages here on Wikipedia, which are pretty great. I honestly ask you to look there and look elsewhere to just take a look at the data to help inform your understanding of the current state of the electorate and the current state of what might be a Pete Buttigieg campaign. Kamala Harris, in a race against many of the other candidates, averages about 28.4% in the Democratic primary. I imagine that if she does decide to run, many of these other Democrats will not run, but I do think a considerable portion of those who are currently being polled will run no matter what. But what it does here is show that Kamala Harris is at 28%, but Pete Buttigieg comes in at 14.3%. He comes in at second place, and in the polling without Kamala Harris, actually leads the national average. Now, this is against Governor Gavin Newsom of California, Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. It really is interesting at baseline seeing that Pete Buttigieg is doing this well. And it isn't to say that it's not deserving or that it's not something that you can expect, given that he did do quite well in the 2020 Democratic primary. But based on the competition that he is up against, it feels very similar to that of 2020. But this time, Pete might have the upper hand going into it rather than doing quite well in a shock race in Iowa, leading into New Hampshire, but then eventually dropping out of the race. I think that what we are finding is that Pete Buttigieg is doing well because he is going around the country, not only here, but also doing things that are intentional in terms of his media hits, right? Where is he going? He is going to podcasts that are primarily listened to by men. And I know it sounds simple and it sounds rudimentary. It sounds simple in terms of explaining the style of campaigning that feels very different than Pete Buttigieg's 2020 campaign. When you think about what he ran on, forgive me, right back in 2020, we were talking about different sets of circumstances. Donald Trump was president, but under different circumstances. Pete Buttigieg had not been in a presidential administration, and he was very much seen as young, ambitious, and talented. The same things can be true now, but he has the experience coming from an administration, and he also seems to be leveraging the fact that many Democrats are not out there. AOC and Bernie, right, they have their own thing, right? Tim Walz is on a listening tour. Right? Who else is out there? There are plenty of other people who are trying to get out there. But a lot of the big names that you are seeing Buttigieg potentially rivaled up against are either caught up because they are currently governors right now and they have to worry about their budget. They have to worry about what's happening in their own state. But the point is here that Buttigieg actually gave himself a segue by not running for Senate, instead can focus on running in 2028. Pete Buttigieg all but confirmed he is actively toying with the idea that he might want to run, because when interviewed about whether or not he'll run in 2028, his answer was actually quite simple. It was that he would look at the table and see if he can bring anything more to it. And if he could, chances are he'd run. At least that's paraphrased roughly what he said. Point is, he's toying with it. He has this in his idea and his mind that he might be running for president. At any time a candidate might be running, they are running for president. Right? You're going to reject it from the very beginning, and then you're going to say, oh, this could be fun, right? It could be an interesting time, obviously. And then you form an exploratory committee, then you actually do it. Buttigieg is laying that foundation so that in a year or 2 years' time, should he want to do it, his name is already household amongst the average in-tune Democratic voter, right? Those who vote in primaries are often the most informed, the most engaged, the most partisan. They'll know, or they do know, Pete Buttigieg. If not, they will. And that is the point of these things. Same thing with AOC. This tour and going around the country, doing the media hits, doing the things that get you into spaces that get you to be known. And Buttigieg, again, like I said, isn't just doing the Manosphere podcast to win over that Democratic voter. It's also because it lays the foundation not just for a presidential on the primary end, but on the general end too. Going into Fox News, Pete Buttigieg is always there. What Democrats are watching Fox News? Chances are not that many. But what it is doing is, again, it's priming the idea that he'd be there in the general, and it's showing that he can do well in oppositional spaces. Something that Democratic primary voters are going to be looking for their candidate in 2028. And so I think what we are seeing here with Buttigieg not running for Senate, a lot of people asked, why is it he's not running for Senate? Well, honestly, I think the answer is quite simple. One, he recently moved to Michigan. Yes, his family is in Michigan, but his whole thing in 2020 was being mayor of South Bend, Indiana, which is not Michigan. Two, Michigan is a swing state. And while I don't doubt that Michigan will vote blue in 2026, just given based off what we've seen in the past 6 months and what we will likely see over the next year and a half, the Senate race might have been trickier for Pete Buttigieg than he would have hoped. It would have required intense campaigning solely in a state. He couldn't go out of the states and try to focus elsewhere because it would look obvious that he was not only trying to win a Senate race, but then run for president. It also is a fact, too, that not being from the state was going to be potentially harmful. There are plenty of candidates in the Democratic primary right now, and some that have soon to be announced or will announce, that could run for Senate in Michigan that could actually do quite well across the state. And not to say that Pete Buttigieg wouldn't, but the concern here would be that if the circumstances were not right or conducive to a Democratic victory in 2026 in Michigan, which seems extreme but certainly possible, if it happened, his entire political career would largely be over. Running for Senate and then running for president, we have never had a nominee who has lost a Senate bid 2 years before they became the nominee for president. And so if the target is president and not, looking at the Senate in Washington, D.C., then the purpose here and what you will find to be the truth for these candidates, this would be a bump in the road, not a stepping stone. It would be a hindrance on the ability for you to go out and go elsewhere. And it could be the true end of your political career. It's not lost on me that down in Georgia, Brian Kemp doesn't want to run for Senate, not because Brian Kemp is done with electoral politics. No. If anything, he wants a higher office. And it very much seems pretty clear to me, at least, that Brian Kemp uses this as a position because he doesn't see the Senate as a stepping stone, but rather a bump in the road to run for president. And so while I think Buttigieg, again, is laying that foundation and framework, and I love those two terms. I'm sorry that I keep repeating it, but I think it's true. I think it helps him in the long run, at least for name ID, at least for getting to a position where you're doing well in those primaries, because that's what's likely going to happen. Because he's doing this early, and because many other Democrats simply are not. Bernie's not running for president, right? He's doing the tours, but he's not running for president. AOC probably isn't running for president either, but is doing the tours. Buttigieg is, and has been very open about his ambitions in the past and very open to the idea of running this time around. I mean, it is so clear to me. I really do think that's going to happen, that he's going to run. Whether he'll win, that's something that the voters will decide. But these are the things that we sort of look at. And when it looks to the presidential election, that is going to be the real test for all of these Democrats, is that is going to be in the minds of a lot of these voters who, might have seen if this was a second-term Biden presidency or in some strange reality, right, we were Kamala Harris running for president, decides if had she won, right, decided she was only doing one term, open primary, whatever it might be, way different circumstances. But because Donald Trump is president, that issue of electability is going to be in the minds of many voters. Unfortunately for Pete Buttigieg, and this is where the Senate race was seen as potentially beneficial, is that if you cannot prove to voters that you cannot win a general election, they will likely not vote for you. You could have the best ideas, you could have the most inspirational campaign, but if they do not think you will win, voters are largely pragmatic in primaries when they are paying attention. They will not vote for you. Think back to 2020. We're on a lot of topics that Democrats were fighting over. The Green New Deal, Medicare for all, closing or opening, not opening because I don't think that's a fair term for it, but taking down the wall, right? All of these things that many Democrats were fighting over from 2017 through 2020. A lot of the times, the things that would pull the best were the policy platform points from Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And yet, they didn't win. And it isn't because, these candidates were toxic or bad for the brand to these voters. Rather, there were a lot of Democrats out there who voted for Joe Biden in that nomination because they believed he could win the election, because they believed he was the most electable. For Pete Buttigieg, there has been no statewide election that he has ran in and won. He did run statewide in Indiana, but it was Indiana, and it was a state that Romney won. Obama did win once, though. Keep that in mind. But Romney won. Trump has won by 15 points plus every single election, won in the last election by 19 points. So it isn't really a concern on that end for the Indiana race, but there will be some questions, right? Buttigieg faced a lot of experience questions in the first time. I don't imagine he'll get them this time. Serving in the cabinet is more than enough experience to actually know, at least to some degree, what the office does. And experience isn't necessarily the most amazing indicator of how well someone will do in an election or how well they will govern in the actual office. But that will be a question. Can he beat J.D. Vance? Can he beat Brian Kemp? Can he beat Marco Rubio? Whoever decides to run. And those will be the things that people will be thinking about. So Buttigieg right now, again, seems pretty obvious that he wants to run for president. Seems like he is going to be doing this for a while. Going on these tours, listening around, speaking on behalf of Democrats, and trying to answer questions that Republicans and even some Democrats just aren't answering at this point. It's giving voters a person to look to that can represent the Democratic Party in an absence of a clear political leader. And I think that's something that is objectively going to be beneficial to his campaign, should he decide to run. So keep an eye out on Pete Buttigieg. Keep an eye out on many other Democrats as they start to do very similar things. As campaign season ramps up for the midterms, don't be shocked if you start to see Josh Shapiro campaigning in Arizona. Don't be shocked if you start to see, because we've seen it before with Shapiro and with Whitmer campaigning elsewhere, because this is what they do. This is how you lay again, I'm going to say it, foundation and framework for a presidential election bid, and Pete Buttigieg just so happens to be one of the first to do it, but we will likely see many to come. Pete Buttigieg will not be the last. It'll be a very interesting next year and a half through the midterms to see who announces, who does an exploratory committee, who gets into this game early, because it looks like the elections are starting earlier and earlier, and Democrats are at a point right now where, in again this absence of a clear political leader, they are looking to someone, and Pete Buttigieg, amongst many other Democrats, are trying to fill that void. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2025 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.